The announcement was delivered with ceremonial grandeur across the imperial capital, a proclamation broadcast to thousands of worlds bound under the authority of the Aurelian stellar empire. The heir to one of the oldest ruling lineages in the galaxy would enter a strategic union with a representative of humanity, a species recently admitted into the outer diplomatic framework of interstellar governance. The empire presented the union as a symbol of stability, a gesture of benevolent inclusion toward a civilization considered technologically promising yet politically insignificant. To the imperial court, the decision was neither romantic nor risky. It was administrative. Humanity, in the perception of the empire's ruling elite, occupied a predictable category within the hierarchy of intelligent species. They were resilient, yes, but undisciplined. Innovative, yet emotionally volatile. Their rapid technological development had drawn curiosity, but their lack of unified expansion doctrine marked them as immature participants in galactic affairs. They survived conflicts rather than controlled them. They adapted rather than dominated. To the empire, such traits suggested endurance, not threat. Princess Illyra accepted the arrangement with the composure expected of her station. She had been raised to understand that her role within the empire extended beyond personal preference. Alliances were instruments of stability, and stability preserved civilization. The human she was to marry was described as a diplomatic observer attached to humanity's External Relations Council. His profile contained no extraordinary achievements, no military command, no political authority. He was, by all recorded metrics, unremarkable. Unremarkable. When he arrived at the palace, expectation met contradiction in the most understated form imaginable. The human did not display the deferential anxiety commonly observed in representatives of younger civilizations. Nor did he attempt to assert presence through ceremonial gestures. He simply observed. His posture conveyed neither submission nor pride. His attention moved with quiet precision across architecture, personnel, and spatial arrangement, as though every detail held equal relevance. Imperial observers interpreted the behavior as cultural restraint. Illyra initially agreed. Yet during the formal introduction, she detected something difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The human's gaze did not linger upon symbols of authority or displays of power. Instead, he assessed transitions doorways, security rotations, structural seams within the palace's vast design. It was not curiosity. It was measurement. His name, he explained, was Adrian Voss. His voice remained calm, neither deferential nor assertive, carrying a tone that suggested complete acceptance of circumstance without surrender to it. When addressed, he responded precisely. When ignored, he did not react. The imperial court, accustomed to emotional transparency among foreign envoys, found his composure faintly disquieting. The marriage ceremony proceeded according to tradition, a spectacle of cosmic significance transmitted across the empire's domains. Illyra performed her role flawlessly, projecting unity and confidence. Adrian Voss mirrored her composure without visible effort. Observers later noted that he made no attempt to impress the court. He neither sought attention nor avoided it. He simply remained present, as though his purpose existed independently of recognition, within the private chambers assigned to them. Following the ceremony, silence settled not as discomfort, but as equilibrium. Illyra studied her husband with analytical curiosity. She had expected tension, perhaps reverence or unease. Instead, she encountered stillness. When she questioned his perception of the alliance, he answered with measured clarity. Humanity valued stability. Cooperation reduced conflict. Survival favored those who adapted early. His words contained no flattery, no ambition, no visible agenda. Yet as their conversation concluded, Illyra observed a detail that unsettled her. composure for the first time since the arrangement had been announced. While speaking, Adrian had subtly adjusted his position within the chamber, not toward comfort, but toward alignment with structural reinforcement points embedded within the palace walls. It was a movement so slight that most observers would not have noticed. To Alira, trained in spatial awareness from childhood, it signaled deliberate evaluation. In the cycles that followed, Imperial analysts conducted routine assessment of the new diplomatic union. Reports classified the human as compliant, non-disruptive, and strategically irrelevant. His activities remained limited to observation, consultation, and participation in ceremonial obligations. He requested no authority. He offered no demands. He expressed no ambition beyond the maintenance of stability between humanity and the Empire. Yet, within restricted intelligence archives, anomalies began to accumulate without formal designation. Predictive security models concerning the Imperial Palace required recalibration following minor structural adjustments, recommended during Adrian's orientation review. Threat simulations previously categorized as negligible began registering marginal increases in probability, before stabilizing again without cause. Communication routing protocols proposed by the human envoy reduced systemic vulnerabilities that had not been publicly acknowledged. None of these changes indicated threat. All suggested foresight. Princess Alira maintained outward composure while privately re-evaluating her assumptions. The man she had married did not behave like a political instrument. He behaved like an observer embedded within a system he intended to understand completely. He did not seek influence. He positioned himself where influence would eventually become unnecessary. One evening, as the imperial capital rotated beneath its star, Alira encountered Adrian within a high observation corridor overlooking the city's defensive grid. He stood in silence, studying the network of orbital installations that protected the Empire's heart world. When she asked what he observed, he answered without hesitation. "Stability," he said calmly. "And the points where stability depends on assumption." Alira recognized then that she had not married a harmless envoy. She had married a man who perceived vulnerability not as weakness, but as information. And somewhere beyond the ceremonial unity of the alliance, the first consequence of that perception had already begun. In the weeks following the marriage, the imperial capital resumed its flawless rhythm, a civilization engineered to project permanence. Star traffic followed precise corridors through layered defensive fields. Administrative fleets orbited in disciplined formation. Every system functioned with the quiet confidence of a power that had not faced existential threat in centuries. Yet beneath this polished stability, Princess Alira began to perceive subtle distortions, small deviations that could not be explained by coincidence or routine fluctuation. It began with predictive modeling discrepancies. The Empire's strategic foresight arrays, designed to simulate long-term threat evolution, began producing conflicting projections regarding peripheral border systems. Minor statistical shifts suggested that several historically stable regions now carried increased probability of external interference. The changes were fractional, easily dismissed as recalibration noise, but they were persistent. Each revision returned to the same conclusion. The Empire's security relied not on strength alone, but on a set of assumptions that had never been challenged simultaneously. Alira requested a private briefing from the Intelligence Council. Their explanation was confident yet unsatisfying. Systems had undergone optimization following advisory input from the human diplomatic envoy. Efficiency improvements, they assured her, inevitably altered prediction baselines. The modifications enhanced resilience. They did not introduce vulnerability. The princess accepted the explanation publicly. Privately, she began to observe Adrian Voss more closely. He moved through imperial structures without hesitation, yet never intruded where he had not been invited. He attended policy sessions as a silent observer. He requested access only to publicly accessible archives. He made no strategic recommendations beyond those framed as cooperative stability measures. To external perception, he embodied restraint, but Alira noticed a pattern invisible to most observers. Adrian did not gather information randomly. He gathered transitions. Communication latency between fleet sectors. Command relay redundancy within defense networks. Response times for automated interdiction systems. He studied not strength itself, but the intervals between actions, the brief spaces where decision replaced automation. One evening, within the palace's internal archive sphere, Alira confronted him directly. The chamber glowed with layered projections of imperial history, each event preserved as an immutable record. Adrian stood alone within the light, reviewing a simulation of the Empire's earliest expansion wars. "You study our vulnerabilities," she stated without accusation. He turned calmly, acknowledging the truth without concession. "I study stability. Stability depends on understanding where systems assume continuity." "You speak as though continuity can be interrupted." "It always can," he replied. "The question is whether interruption is anticipated." Alira expected evasion. Instead, she encountered clarity. He did not deny intention. He defined it differently. "What does humanity anticipate?" she asked quietly. Adrian considered the question for several moments before answering. "That every civilization eventually meets an event it did not plan for. Survival favors those who prepare before necessity becomes visible." His response contained no threat, yet its certainty carried weight greater than confrontation. In the cycles that followed, the Empire experienced a sequence of minor external disturbances. A trade convoy vanished near a frontier relay point before reappearing with navigational systems inexplicably reset. A long-range sensor array reported transient energy signatures inconsistent with known technologies. Border patrols detected probes of unknown origin that withdrew before interception. Each incident was isolated. None justified alarm. But together, they suggested testing careful measurement of imperial response thresholds. The Intelligence Council attributed the anomalies to emerging independent factions beyond recognized space. Alira requested Adrian's assessment. He provided none. He simply asked whether the Empire had rehearsed a scenario in which multiple minor disruptions occurred simultaneously across distant sectors. "We have no adversary capable of coordinating such action," a counselor responded confidently. Adrian inclined his head slightly, neither agreeing nor disputing the assertion. The turning point arrived without spectacle. A classified communication reached the imperial capital from a monitoring station positioned at the edge of uncharted space. The message contained a single verified observation. A formation of vessels had appeared briefly beyond detection range, not entering imperial territory, not initiating contact, merely observing. Their configuration suggested coordination among multiple unknown species. Their technology exceeded recorded benchmarks. The Intelligence Council convened in secrecy. Their conclusion remained consistent with doctrine. Observation did not constitute threat. The Empire's superiority rendered preemptive concern unnecessary. "Princess." Alira requested Adrian's presence at the final session. When asked for his evaluation, he spoke only one sentence. "Observation precedes commitment." Silence followed. The council dismissed the statement as analytical speculation. That same cycle, Adrian requested permission to review emergency coordination protocols for civilian evacuation networks. The request was framed as a cooperative study intended to improve joint humanitarian response frameworks between humanity and the Empire. The Council approved without hesitation. Alira did not. She reviewed the authorization personally. The scope of access granted to her husband extended beyond humanitarian logistics into strategic infrastructure mapping. It allowed him to understand how the Empire preserved continuity under stress. She confronted him again, this time within a secure observation chamber overlooking the Imperial Fleet's Central Command spire. Starships drifted in perfect formation. Beyond the transparent barrier, silent symbols of unquestioned dominance. "You prepare for a crisis you believe inevitable," she said. "I prepare for a response," Adrian corrected calmly. "To what?" He met her gaze without aggression, without secrecy, only with certainty that felt immovable. To the moment assumption fails. Elara followed his line of sight toward the distant defensive grid encircling their world. For the first time since childhood, the vast network did not appear invulnerable. It appeared conditional powerful so long as no one forced it to operate beyond its design. Within restricted Imperial archives, new data began accumulating without public acknowledgement. External observation events increased in frequency. Communication. Interference appeared in sectors previously untouched by disruption. And embedded within the Empire's predictive models, one new projection emerged repeatedly before being flagged as statistically improbable. A scenario in which humanity was no longer categorized as a minor participant in galactic power structures. Elara did not yet understand why, but she began to suspect that her marriage had not created an alliance, that it had created a vantage point. The imperial capital had always believed that power revealed itself through force armadas, conquest vectors, declared intent. What emerged beyond imperial borders revealed itself through absence instead. Signals that should have existed simply did not. Patrol reports arrived precisely on time, yet contained inexplicable gaps in telemetry. Observation platforms captured distortions at the edge of measurable space, movements that appeared only when analyzed collectively across multiple sensors. These were not acts of aggression. They were measurements. Something unknown was studying the Empire's rhythm, mapping not its weapons but its reactions. Princess Elara stood within the strategic observatory as layered projections unfolded across the chamber's vast curvature. Analysts presented synchronized timelines of anomalies previously dismissed as statistical irregularities. Individually, each event appeared trivial. Combined, they formed an expanding sphere of attention focused on communication channels, decision hierarchies, and the temporal delay between authority and action. The implication unsettled even the most disciplined advisors. The phenomenon was not testing strength. It was measuring vulnerability embedded within process itself. It is structured curiosity, one senior strategist concluded, projecting confidence that bordered on denial. There is no evidence of hostility. Elara allowed the statement to settle before speaking, then define hostility. At what point does observation become preparation? Her question destabilized the chamber's certainty. Imperial doctrine defined threat only through overt violation. Anything less remained categorized as manageable uncertainty. The Empire's greatest strength had always been clarity. Now ambiguity itself had become an adversary. At the periphery of the Council formation, Adrian Voss observed silently. He did not challenge the analysis. He did not reinforce it. His attention remained fixed on the data, as though each fragment confirmed a structure already understood. When Elara finally requested his perspective, he answered with measured calm. Hostility, he explained, rarely began with attack. It began with understanding how to make attack unnecessary. The chamber absorbed the statement without response, yet its implications could not be dismissed. Reconnaissance operations intensified across frontier sectors. Deep-range vessels extended beyond traditional patrol boundaries. sensor arrays recalibrated to detect phenomena previously classified as noise. Several ships returned with data fragments that defied existing frameworks, geometric formations, in deep space that reconfigured faster than automated tracking could resolve. Synchronized emissions exchanged among distant, unknown points. Gravitational disturbances indicating controlled mass movement on unprecedented scale. None of these observations demonstrated direct engagement. All of them suggested deliberate coordination among multiple external entities. Within the palace, Adrian's role remained unchanged in form, yet expanded in consequence. He continued reviewing cooperative defense structures, refining contingency response architectures, and developing adaptive resilience protocols designed to preserve functionality during systemic disruption. He did not request military command authority. He did not advocate preemptive action. His recommendations emphasized distributed decision capacity, autonomous local response, and the preservation of continuity when centralized control failed. The Empire interpreted these contributions as pragmatic efficiency. Alera recognized them as preparation for fragmentation. Their private discussions reflected the growing gravity of unfolding events. One evening, within a chamber overlooking the planet's illuminated night hemisphere, Alera spoke without ceremonial restraint. She acknowledged the precision with which Adrian's analysis aligned with emerging reality. He did not accept validation. He explained simply that civilizations projecting superiority inevitably attracted examination. Examination invited challenge. The sequence was neither malicious nor extraordinary. It was structural. Endurance required adaptation rather than assumption of permanence. Long-range listening arrays soon detected synchronized transmissions originating from multiple unmapped regions beyond Imperial territory. The emissions did not target Imperial infrastructure. They interacted with each other, exchanging structured data across immense distances in patterns indicating collective evaluation. Intelligence analysis concluded that the Empire was not being approached by a singular adversary, but assessed by a distributed external alliance forming without formal declaration. The realization altered strategic posture without altering doctrine. Preparatory reinforcement began quietly across frontier systems. Defensive networks recalibrated. Fleet readiness increased. Communication redundancy expanded. Each measure demonstrated overwhelming strength, yet each adjustment also revealed responsiveness to external influence. The Empire remained dominant, but it was no longer unquestioned. Reaction itself became observable behavior. During a restricted strategic review, Alera accessed a predictive simulation modeling coordinated disruption rather than direct assault. The scenario depicted simultaneous interference across multiple communication nodes, fragmenting synchronization between sectors without decisive engagement. The model predicted not immediate defeat, but structural disunity, localized systems operating independently. Authority delayed, coherence degraded. Embedded within the simulation architecture were refinements originating from human advisory. Analysis. These modifications did not amplify offensive capability. They enhanced survivability under fragmentation. That discovery transformed Alera's understanding of her husband's presence within the Empire. Adrian had not come to reshape imperial power. He had come to ensure that when tested, it would not collapse completely. His restraint was not passivity. It was preparation aligned with inevitability. The external observers eventually transmitted a message deliberately structured for interpretation. Unlike previous emissions, this communication contained semantic clarity rather than abstract pattern. Automated translation matrices converged on a single statement. Initial evaluation complete. The message was not addressed exclusively to the Empire. It referenced humanity as a co-equal variable within the assessment framework. When Illyra delivered the report to Adrian, his reaction was neither surprise nor alarm. He received the information with quiet recognition, as though a predicted threshold had finally been reached. She asked what the message implied. His answer carried no dramatization, only certainty shaped by long familiarity with historical sequence. The period of observation had concluded. What followed would not be curiosity. It would be decision. The Empire had prepared for invasion, rebellion, and internal collapse across centuries of dominance, yet it had never prepared for judgment delivered without declaration. The translated transmission initial evaluation complete, propagated through restricted command channels with escalating priority. Strategic doctrine demanded classification before response, but classification itself had fractured. There was no fleet formation to track, no territory seized, no ultimatum issued. There was only the unmistakable transition from observation to intent and the unsettling awareness that the Empire had been measured alongside humanity as a co-variable within a larger calculus. Princess Illyra authorized the formation of a unified threat synthesis council, drawing analysts from military, scientific, and diplomatic hierarchies previously separated by doctrine. The resulting models revealed a pattern too coherent to dismiss. The distributed phenomena across imperial space behaved not as independent anomalies, but as nodes within a coordinated structure. Energy fluctuations aligned across light years with precision exceeding imperial synchronization capabilities. Gravitational signatures shifted in control gradients, subtly altering navigational baselines without detectable propulsion. The Empire was not being approached. It was being positioned. Imperial admirals argued for demonstration of force. History had taught that decisive visibility deterred aggression before escalation matured. Illyra listened, then requested probability. Projections for deterrence against an intelligence that had already mapped imperial reaction time, command latency, and resource mobilization thresholds. The models produced silence where certainty had once existed. Power displayed after evaluation offered no strategic novelty. It confirmed predictability. Predictability, Adrian observed quietly, functioned as vulnerability when measured by an adaptive adversary. He presented a framework that diverged from imperial precedent. Instead of concentrating fleets, he proposed distributing resilience. Autonomous command nodes capable of independent coordination, civilian infrastructure hardened to operate under partial informational denial, communication networks designed to function when centralized authority degraded. The objective was not to defeat an unknown adversary through confrontation, but to remain coherent when confrontation became inevitable. The proposal challenged the Empire's foundational assumption that unity required centralization. Illyra recognized the necessity embedded within the discomfort. Implementation began under the designation Contingency Horizon. Shipyards modified control architectures to permit decentralized engagement. Planetary grids integrated redundant governance protocols. Strategic reserves repositioned along trajectories that maximize survivability rather than visibility. None of these measures resembled preparation for traditional war. They resembled preparation for persistence under systematic pressure. Publicly, the Empire framed the changes as modernization. Privately, it acknowledged a shift from dominance to endurance. Signals followed, not warnings, not threats. Structured alterations in the fabric of interstellar space manifested at the boundaries of imperial territory. Navigation corridors elongated by fractional margins, requiring recalibration that propagated across fleets simultaneously. Sensor arrays experienced synchronized latency, as though reality itself delayed confirmation of observed events. These phenomena produced no destruction. They introduced uncertainty into every predictive model. The Empire's greatest strength, its capacity to anticipate, began to erode. Within the palace observatory, Alira confronted the convergence of data with clarity unburdened by denial. The unknown intelligence was not testing weapons. It was testing adaptability. Each systemic disturbance examined whether the Empire could maintain coordinated function under conditions designed to degrade certainty. Humanity's frameworks, already embedded within Imperial infrastructure through Adrian's guidance, responded with measured stability. Local command nodes compensated for delayed directives. Distributed networks rerouted information around disrupted channels. For the first time, Imperial continuity did not depend on centralized command. She turned to Adrian, understanding that his preparation extended beyond advisory influence. His species had not merely adapted to Imperial structures. It had reshaped them toward survivability within an environment of controlled uncertainty. He did not claim foresight. He described pattern recognition learned through long confrontation with forces that did not announce themselves. Survival, he explained, required acceptance that decision often preceded explanation. The adversary had completed evaluation. The next phase would not seek permission. The confirmation arrived without spectacle. Across multiple sectors, synchronized spatial distortions stabilized into persistent configurations. Vast, coherent presences detectable not as objects, but as alterations in fundamental parameters governing motion and communication. The Empire's instruments did not register arrival. They registered imposition. Space had been rewritten in select regions to enforce conditions under which Imperial advantage diminished to statistical insignificance. Emergency protocols activated throughout the capital. Fleets received autonomous engagement authority. Civilian populations transitioned to hardened operational modes. The Empire did not declare war. It acknowledged reality. Alira addressed the council with composure forged through irreversible recognition. Observation had ended. Decision had manifested. The Empire would not meet an enemy at the border. It would endure an intelligence that had chosen the battlefield itself. Adrian remained beside her, expression unchanged, voice steady when he spoke. The conclusion none wished to articulate. Judgment had begun. The Empire's transition into contingency horizon did not halt the progression of imposed conditions. It revealed their purpose. Where Imperial doctrine had once equated stability with control, the new environment rewarded only systems capable of coherent function amid persistent distortion. Across outer sectors, navigation lattice began to drift within narrowly constrained parameters that prevented catastrophic failure yet invalidated long-established routes. Trade convoys arrived late but intact. Patrol formations maintained shape, yet expended disproportionate energy to do so. Nothing collapsed. Everything strained. The message embedded within the pressure was unmistakable. Endurance would be measured, not assumed. Princess Alira convened the council within a chamber, whose walls projected live feeds from across Imperial space. The visual tapestry no longer displayed hostile fleets or advancing weapons, but the continuous choreography of adjustment. Worlds recalibrated orbital infrastructures. Ship captains altered vector predictions mid-course. Civil administrations executed redundancy protocols designed under Adrian's framework. It was also learning how much of its identity had depended upon the illusion of permanence. Admiralty factions pressed for a decisive response. They argued that an intelligence imposing systemic constraints could be compelled into engagement through targeted disruption of the altered regions. Alira requested simulation outcomes based on current data fidelity. The projections returned with consistent variance. Intervention produced unpredictable amplification of distortions rather than resolution. The environment behaved not as passive terrain, but as an active participant maintaining imposed parameters. The Empire could expend force. It could not dictate effect. Adrian proposed a counterintuitive approach grounded in human strategic history. Survival depended upon selective concession that preserved core capability. He recommended deliberate de-escalation within designated zones, withdrawal of concentrated assets, and public acknowledgement that the empire would not contest imposed boundaries while it adapted. The proposal challenged imperial pride, yet its logic aligned with emerging evidence. Resistance without comprehension accelerated degradation. Adaptation without provocation preserved operational continuity. Elira authorized the first concession. Civilian infrastructures transitioned to distributed governance models, refined under Horizon protocols. Communication networks adopted asynchronous confirmation standards, accepting delayed verification as normal rather than anomalous. The empire did not retreat from fear. The distinction mattered strategically and symbolically. It marked the moment when dominance yielded to deliberate survival. The response from the unknown intelligence manifested as modulation rather than escalation. Distortions within vacated regions stabilized at constant intensity. Zones beyond imperial withdrawal remained unaffected. The pattern suggested recognition of behavioral change, not hostility, recognition. Elira understood the implication with sobering clarity. The empire's choices were being incorporated into an ongoing evaluation whose criteria remained opaque, yet responsive to demonstrated adaptability. Within the palace, political opposition intensified. Traditionalist leaders condemned concession as surrender disguised in technical language. They demanded restoration of visible supremacy to maintain internal cohesion. Elira addressed them with evidence rather than rhetoric. She presented continuity metrics across sectors, implementing distributed resilience against those attempting conventional control. The difference was not ideological. It was functional. Regions embracing adaptation retained governance integrity. Amid this transformation, humanity's role shifted from advisory to foundational. Human-designed decision architectures enabled local authorities to operate without awaiting central confirmation. Emergency resource allocation followed probabilistic models that accepted uncertainty as baseline input. Training doctrines emphasized initiative constrained by shared intent rather than rigid command. Imperial officers educated under these systems began to exhibit behaviors once considered culturally foreign. It was acquiring capacities humanity had refined under long exposure to indifferent environments. The next signal arrived as an absence. For the first time since evaluation had been declared complete, a region previously subject to persistent imposition returned to baseline parameters without transitional disturbance. Instruments confirmed stability across multiple independent arrays. No explanation accompanied the change. No communication acknowledged it. The council debated interpretation, yet the timing aligned precisely with the empire's full implementation of distributed resilience protocols within that sector. Concession followed by adaptation had produced measurable relief. Elira reframed imperial strategy accordingly. The objective was not to defeat an unseen adversary, but to converge toward operational states that reduced imposed pressure. She ordered expansion of Horizon frameworks across remaining territories, prioritizing sectors whose governance remained dependent on centralized authority. The empire would not wait for further demonstration. It would become difficult to destabilize by design. Adrian observed the transition with quiet resolve. He did not celebrate partial stabilization. He recognized pattern continuity. The intelligence shaping conditions was not seeking tribute or territory. It was selecting for systems capable of maintaining coherence under constraint. Humanity's historical trajectory had prepared it for precisely such selection. At the edge of imperial space, new regions of altered parameters emerged, not as expansion, but as delineation boundaries. defining a domain where imposed conditions would persist until adaptation matured. The galaxy had not been conquered. It had been partitioned into gradients of survivability. The first concession did not end the judgment. It demonstrated that response influenced outcome. For the first time since evaluation began, the Empire possessed a strategy that did not depend on understanding the adversary's origin. It depended on mastering its own resilience. Stability returned to portions of imperial space not as restoration, but as earned equilibrium. The sectors that had fully implemented distributed resilience protocols maintained coherent governance under conditions that would have shattered the Empire months earlier. Trade resumed along adaptive corridors that recalculated themselves in real time. Military formations abandoned rigid doctrine in favor of fluid coordination, each vessel functioning as both participant and anchor in a network defined by shared intent rather than central command. The transformation was measurable. It was also expensive. Every gain in continuity required surrender of certainty once considered essential to imperial identity. The first concession had preserved the Empire's structure, but it had also exposed disparities among worlds. Regions that embraced adaptation stabilized. Those that resisted descended into controlled disorder, not through destruction, but through persistent inefficiency that eroded authority. Civil unrest emerged not from fear of the unknown intelligence, but from internal recognition that survival demanded change many refused to accept. The Empire was not collapsing. It was shedding assumptions that could not endure. Admiralty Command submitted revised projections, indicating that resource allocation under Horizon protocols would reduce visible military dominance for multiple cycles. Fleet concentrations once maintained as symbols of supremacy dispersed into autonomous clusters optimized for persistence. Traditionalists argued that diminished visibility invited opportunistic aggression from rival powers. Yet external observers had already adjusted their posture. The galaxy watched adaptation as the only reliable defense against pressure that ignored allegiance. Adrian introduced a refinement that redefined sacrifice within strategic calculus. He proposed designated resilience crucible zones where imperial systems would intentionally operate under heightened distortion without withdrawal, accelerating adaptation through controlled exposure. The concept derived from human historical practice. Endurance improved when systems confronted stress directly rather than avoiding it. The Council recognized the risk. Yet avoidance offered only delayed vulnerability. Elera authorized limited implementation, selecting sectors with sufficient redundancy to absorb potential collapse. The crucibles altered imperial psychology. Civil administrators executed governance while predictive models fluctuated beyond conventional tolerance. Each success expanded operational thresholds. The Empire began to treat uncertainty not as anomaly but as environment. The unknown intelligence responded with precise modulation. Distortions intensified within crucible zones, then receded when local coherence improved. The pattern reinforced. It was actively engaged. Political opposition reorganized around a new accusation that the Empire had entered a silent pact with an unseen force, trading sovereignty for survival. Elera addressed the charge without rhetorical defense. She presented continuity metrics across crucible sectors compared to regions clinging to pre-Horizon doctrine. The data revealed a stark gradient. Where adaptation advanced, governance persisted. Where resistance endured, systemic erosion accelerated. Sovereignty, she argued, was not preserved through defiance detached from outcome. It was preserved through capacity to function under reality as it existed. Within the palace, private deliberation sharpened the strategic horizon. Adrian articulated the implication emerging from successive interactions. It sought demonstration that complex civilizations could sustain coherence without imposing catastrophic instability. Humanity's long survival under unpredictable forces had cultivated precisely such resilience. The Empire, by aligning with these principles, was not yielding dominance. It was redefining it as endurance without escalation. The cost became undeniable when a crucible sector experienced catastrophic failure. A cascade of governance breakdowns, initiated by compounded decision latency, forced emergency evacuation of multiple habitats. Lives were lost not to hostile action but to the Empire's deliberate exposure to pressure. The tragedy reverberated across imperial consciousness. Critics demanded termination of crucible protocols. Illyria convened the council with the full weight of consequence acknowledged. Adaptation, she stated, was not without sacrifice. The alternative was gradual systemic erosion, culminating in uncontrollable collapse under conditions none of the Empire's choosing. The unknown intelligence's response to the failure was immediate and unambiguous. Distortions within the affected sector reduced to baseline stability, permitting recovery operations without interference. The modulation resembled recognition of cost borne and lesson integrated. It did not erase loss. Across imperial space, a new cultural alignment emerged. Humanity's influence, once subtle, became foundational. Training doctrines emphasized initiative bounded by responsibility to collective continuity. Civil education incorporated probabilistic reasoning and adaptive governance as core competencies. At the boundary of imposed regions, sensors registered a phenomenon unprecedented in scale. Multiple sectors simultaneously exhibited synchronized reduction in distortion intensity following completion of horizon integration. The pattern suggested a threshold had been crossed. Adaptation was no longer isolated. It was systemic. Illyria observed the convergence with measured resolve. The Empire had paid for continuity in certainty, in resources, in lives. It had gained capacity to endure conditions once deemed unacceptable. Adrian stood beside her, expression unchanged, voice quiet when he spoke, the implication now unavoidable. Judgment persisted, but criteria had clarified. The Empire was no longer being tested for power. It was being measured for restraint, coherence, and the ability to survive without destabilizing the fabric within which it existed. The synchronized stabilization across multiple sectors did not produce celebration. It produced calculation. Imperial analysts compared telemetry from every adapted region and discovered a unifying constant, where governance operated through distributed intent, distortion receded to a tolerable equilibrium. Where command structures still depended on rigid central authority, instability persisted with surgical precision. The pattern transformed theory into law. Survival was no longer a matter of resistance. It was a function of coherence under constraint. Princess Illyria addressed the Empire through transmission that replaced triumph with responsibility. She declared the threshold protocol. It was framed as qualification. Worlds unwilling to adapt would not be abandoned, but neither would they dictate the Empire's collective trajectory. Authority would flow toward structures capable of functioning within imposed conditions. Dominion, she announced, would be defined by endurance rather than control. Opposition reached its final intensity. Several high command officials attempted to reassert centralized military doctrine, concentrating fleet assets to demonstrate that decisive force could restore traditional supremacy. The maneuver produced immediate counter-effect. Spatial distortion magnified within the concentrated formation, degrading coordination and forcing emergency dispersal to prevent collision and systemic loss. The lesson required no interpretation. Power expressed without adaptability invited amplification of constraint. Adrian proposed the next strategic evolution. The Empire would not merely endure imposed conditions. It would operate at the threshold where instability and coherence balanced. Precisely. He termed it functional dominion, a state in which systems maintained continuity while expending minimal force to preserve structure. The concept originated from human survival strategies refined across unpredictable environments. Dominance. In this framework was not the imposition of will upon reality, but the capacity to function when reality refused compliance. Implementation demanded transformation at every level. Military doctrine redefined victory as sustained operational integrity rather than territorial assertion. Civil governance prioritized redundancy over efficiency, accepting localized imperfection. To preserve systemic resilience, communication protocols adopted adaptive latency, allowing decisions to propagate organically through networks rather than descend from singular authority. The empire ceased attempting to eliminate uncertainty. It learned to shape response within it. The unknown intelligence responded with unprecedented clarity of effect. It settled into a stable background condition that no longer impeded navigation, governance, or coordination. The environment had not returned to pre-evaluation state. It had integrated the empire's adaptation into a new baseline. Stability was no longer granted. It was co-created through demonstrated capacity. Alera recognized the implication with profound gravity. The empire had crossed from subject of evaluation to participant in a systemic equilibrium. She convened the council to formalize the shift. The first concession had preserved continuity. The cost of continuity had redefined sovereignty. The threshold of dominion established a new imperial identity grounded not in supremacy over others, but in mastery of self-limiting power. The transition demanded a final act of strategic restraint. Several peripheral polities, observing imperial adaptation, petitioned for protective integration. Traditional doctrine would have accepted expansion as confirmation of restored dominance. Alera refused immediate annexation. Instead, she offered knowledge transfer horizon protocols without imperial control. The decision stunned both allies and rivals. It also produced measurable response. Distortion along shared borders diminished further, as if the environment acknowledged reduction of destabilizing ambition. Within the palace observatory, Adrian reviewed long-range sensor arrays that extended beyond imperial space. Regions untouched. By imposed conditions remained unchanged, yet faint indicators suggested potential extension should instability propagate outward. The intelligence shaping reality was not confined to the empire. It monitored systemic behavior across the galaxy. Adaptation within one civilization influenced the environment for others. Responsibility had expanded beyond survival. Alera stood beside him, absorbing the weight of consequence. Dominion no longer signified possession. It signified stewardship of behavior capable of sustaining equilibrium. Humanity's influence, once peripheral, now defined the empire's operational philosophy, not through conquest, through example. At the boundary, where distortion met unaltered space, a phenomenon emerged that no prior model predicted. A region of perfect stability formed, not imposed, but arising spontaneously where multiple adapted sectors intersected. Sensors confirmed. Absence of distortion, absence of strain, absence of imposed constraint. It was not a reward. It was a demonstration of what coherence could produce when no destabilizing impulse remained. The empire had reached the threshold. Power had not been taken. It had been relinquished in forms that threatened continuity and retained in forms that sustained it. For the first time since evaluation began, the galaxy observed a civilization capable of existing without provoking correction. The judgment had not ended. It had evolved into coexistence defined by discipline. The stabilized sectors, now operating under functional dominion, it was not communication, not in the conventional sense, but a measurable coherence that rippled through the fabric of space in regions previously under the intelligence's imposed distortions. Imperial analysts struggled to quantify it. The pattern suggested recognition, a calculated acknowledgement that the Empire's adaptation aligned with an unknown standard. No fleet had crossed borders, no weapon fired, yet the message was undeniable. The Empire was no longer an object of testing. It had become a collaborator in equilibrium. Princess Alira convened the council to interpret the implications. Scholars, tacticians, and advisors gathered in the orbital observatory, watching data streams that now spanned thousands of light years. Adrian stood beside her silently, letting the analysts argue over meaning. When Alira asked him for clarity, he spoke plainly. The assessment was not of submission. It was of endurance. What you have achieved is coexistence on terms defined by functionality, not force. The galaxy has learned that the Empire can maintain coherence without asserting dominance in conventional ways. The room remained tense. The Empire's pride bruised by the invisible hand that had reshaped understanding of power. Admirals murmured, civil administrators fretted, and traditionalists whispered of betrayal. But the metrics were unambiguous. Regions embracing functional dominion displayed unparalleled operational continuity. Economic activity, governance stability, military readiness, all functioning at peak efficiency within conditions that would have previously crippled even minor worlds. Humanity's influence had turned theory into tangible survival strategy, transforming abstract adaptation into replicable procedure. Across Imperial space, the silent signals continued to stabilize. Previously compromised navigation grids synchronized seamlessly. Sensor arrays detected subtle gravitational harmonics aligning along interstellar distances, as though the galaxy itself had drawn new maps to accommodate coherent civilizations. No aggression accompanied the recalibration. There was only balance. The intelligence had shifted from examination to passive interaction. Its presence remained, but it no longer imposed directly. It had trusted the Empire to maintain its own resilience, and humanity had guided it to do so. Alira reflected on the implications privately with Adrian. He explained that human history was littered with repeated crises, often without immediate reward or recognition. Civilization survived not through superiority alone, but through learning to function under uncertainty, improvising when structure failed, and sacrificing when necessity demanded. The unknown intelligence recognized those traits instantly. The Empire had gained more than survival. It had received a blueprint for operating within a system larger than itself, an understanding of resilience the galaxy had never observed in an established civilization before. Political opposition tried one last gambit. They demanded visible acts of domination, fleets deployed to assert supremacy, and punitive missions to demonstrate that adaptation had not weakened imperial authority. Alira countered with evidence, illustrating that exertion of force within stabilized sectors produced measurable disruption, often reversing progress achieved under Horizon protocols. Authority enforced through aggression would invite new distortions, undoing the painstakingly established balance. The Empire's survival no longer relied on intimidation. It relied on precision, patience, and strategic restraint, qualities humanity had exemplified in its silent guidance. In private corridors, Adrian observed that the Empire was beginning to internalize human methodology almost instinctively. Officers no longer hesitated to act autonomously when central command delayed. Administrators adjusted local systems to accommodate unforeseen fluctuations without seeking approval. Networks communicated irregularly yet coherently, solving problems the architects had never directly prescribed. Humanity's methods had become embedded, shaping imperial culture as deeply as any law or tradition. The influence was invisible, yet tangible. At the edges of mapped space, Regions once heavily distorted began to exhibit patterns that suggested proactive adaptation. Small clusters of planets experimented with independent governance, leveraging the principles of distributed decision-making. When unexpected anomalies arose, systems corrected themselves with minimal external input. The Empire watched these developments closely, noting that while the unknown intelligence had not imposed guidance here, the example provided by human frameworks produced similar resilience. Adaptation was contagious, not biologically, but structurally, conceptually, and operationally. The Empire had achieved what no prior civilization had: functioning equilibrium under the scrutiny of a higher intelligence, without coercion, without catastrophic conflict. Humanity's influence remained subtle, deliberately non-dominant, yet it had transformed the Empire's capacity to endure. The galaxy witnessed a civilization that had learned to navigate judgment, manipulate consequence, and thrive without triggering escalation, a model unprecedented in scale and precision. Princess Alira understood the gravity of the realization. Power was no longer the exercise of brute force. Immediate comprehension. Humanity had not been defeated, ignored, or overridden. It had been underestimated, and in doing so, it had delivered the Empire from vulnerability. Adrian's presence, quiet and composed, remained a reminder that the lesson extended beyond any single empire or species. Survival required adaptability, patience, and the acceptance that sometimes the most decisive victory is invisible. For the first time since evaluation began, the Empire sensed the full scope of its position. It was neither conquered nor victorious in conventional terms. It was sovereign, but sovereignty was now defined by endurance and the measured application of capability rather than assertion. The galaxy had been observed. The Empire had responded. Humanity had guided it silently, unassumingly, yet irrevocably. The future remained uncertain, but the foundations of dominance, resilience, and survival had been irrevocably realigned. TNT sectors indicated that the next phase of judgment would be subtle, pervasive, and final. It would test not force, not strategy, but the Empire's internalized capacity for autonomous survival, the very principle humanity had embedded. Princess Alira convened the council once more, her expression unreadable. She emphasized the significance of what had been achieved. Fleets no longer required constant oversight. Colonies self-regulated with minimal central intervention, and resource management had become anticipatory rather than reactive. Yet she cautioned that this stability was fragile. One miscalculation could trigger cascading systemic failure. Humanity's guidance had proven decisive, but the intelligence had yet to release the final variable, the test of initiative and judgment under true uncertainty. Adrian presented simulations that modeled potential responses to a hypothetical scenario, simultaneous distortions across multiple critical sectors, compounded by delayed communication and unpredictable internal events. Imperial systems adjusted almost automatically, redistributing resources, rerouting fleets, and reallocating decision authority. Where previously the Empire would have faltered, now it functioned like a living organism, sensing stress and compensating. Instinctively, the demonstration was undeniable. The principles humanity had introduced were fully operational, integrated into the Empire's very approach to survival. Across the Empire, recognition spread quietly but forcefully. Officers, scholars, administrators, and citizens alike sensed a shift. Power no longer resided solely in the hands of rulers. It existed in the collective ability to endure, adapt, and operate effectively under pressure. Traditional measures of dominance, fleet size, territory, weaponry remained, but their relevance had been supplanted by a deeper structural resilience. The galaxy had been observing, and the Empire now understood that real strength lay in coherent function, not aggression. The unknown intelligence responded at last, not through direct contact, not through aggression, but via an unprecedented phenomenon. Across multiple sectors, subtle shifts in fundamental forces aligned in a manner that preserved equilibrium, yet accentuated the consequences of error. It was a demonstration of potential. The empire could function perfectly, or one lapse could cascade into irreversible instability. The principle was simple, brutal, and unmistakable. True survival demanded constant vigilance, adaptability, and unity. Humanity had anticipated this outcome. The empire now lived it. Illyria addressed her people, conveying not triumph, but responsibility. She emphasized that survival was an active choice, maintained moment by moment through coherence, initiative, and sacrifice. The empire had been tested, guided, and transformed. Humanity's silent influence had not subverted sovereignty, it had elevated it, instilling principles that transcended conventional measures of power. The message was clear. Dominance without adaptability was meaningless. Endurance without foresight was fatal. The empire had learned, evolved, and internalized the lessons of an intelligence that operated on a scale beyond comprehension. Humanity, underestimated for millennia, had demonstrated that survival and victory were not solely defined by strength, but by ingenuity, patience, and unyielding adaptability. For the first time, the empire operated not merely to preserve itself, but to anticipate, respond, and thrive under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The galaxy had witnessed a new standard for civilizations, a standard humanity had silently imposed at the edge of the empire, where once distortions threatened collapse. Systems now moved with purpose, aligned in harmony, and prepared for challenges that had yet to arrive. The unknown intelligence had withdrawn its direct imposition, leaving the empire intact, resilient, and subtly changed forever. Humanity had not only survived the evaluation, it had guided an entire civilization to endure, adapt, and thrive in ways the galaxy had never seen. The lesson was final, clear, and chilling for any observer. Underestimate humanity, and one may find that the very forces thought to control the galaxy can be redirected, mastered, and wielded by those previously dismissed. Sovereignty was not merely retained, it had been perfected. Humanity had spoken through action, and the galaxy had listened.